Hi, everybody. Welcome to Debt Precarity Financialization. My name is Chris Hurl. I'm going to moderate the session. And we have two presenters today, Marius Senneville, who's going to be talking about Ant Group's canceled IPO and the trade-off of the Fintech industry within China's economic rebalancing policy. And Leah Barrett Werner talking about a necessary risk, a case for UBI, Universal Basic Income, as permanent post-pandemic policy. So as we have only two presenters, we'll have a lot of time for discussion. I just wanted to begin by providing a little bit of context in terms of where this is all coming from, because it might seem kind of weird that we have a presentation on Ant on the one hand and on UBI on the other. But basically, this was inspired by a class that I taught over the course of the year called Debt Precarity Financialization, where it was a grad course. We had students engaging with the literature on debt precarity and financialization. And I thought that it would be a good fit with this conference, considering just how much, Polanyi has influenced these discussions. So basically how it worked was we started off with 5 students that were interested in this, and I think they all kind of got ground down over the course of the year. So we have 2 left, and Marius and Leah have fantastic presentations. So I'm going to kind of give it over to them, and we're going to start with Marius, and he's going to be speaking about and China's economic rebalancing policy. So take it away, Marius.
All right. Should I go with it? This, and then this. Yep. Does everyone sees it?
Working well.
All right. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here this late in the day. It's currently très ensoleillé in Montreal right now. So thank you for being here. So the bit of research I'm about to present, and which I initially did back in early December 2020, concerns one of the key events of the financial news at the time, namely the early November 2020 cancellation of the stock market entry or initial public offering of Ant Group, one of the key companies in the Chinese digital financial service or Fintech industry, a sector which has undergone a dramatic growth during the last decade, to the point where China's Fintech sector is currently amongst the most important in the world today. Now, just for a bit of background, Ant Group, which was created as an autonomous company in 2014, in fact started out as the financial service division of Alibaba, an e-commerce platform generally known as China's equivalent to our much beloved Amazon sales platform and the brainchild of superstar entrepreneur Jack Ma. So what was peculiar about the cancellation of November 2020 was both the sheer magnitude of the IPO in question and the actors responsible for its interruption. Surpassing both Alibaba's own stock market entry in 2014 and Saudi energy company Aramco in 2019, Ant Group IPO was predicted to reach around $35 billion, which would have resulted in Jack Ma actually regaining the title of the largest IPO ever recorded. Now, besides the size of this lost opportunity, what disturbed even more the financial community was how the cancellation resulted from regulations more or less personally green-lighted by China's President Xi Jinping, who apparently enacted these regulations with the explicit aim of messing with the company's stock market valuation and forcing the interruption of the IPO. Finally, what seemed to make even less sense was how, in Western media at least, the Chinese fintech sector was most often associated with the social credit system, a government-led initiative dedicated to the large-scale surveillance of the Chinese population. And so what I started to research back in early December was the general context of this somewhat surprising confrontation between the new great leader of communist China and this quasi-messianic figure of the Chinese tech industry, Xi Jinping and Jack Ma. And what I figured rather quickly was how these two trajectories were actually not without dissimilarities and were in fact possibly bound to collide at some point. Both were established as key political economic actors at the start of the 2010s, grew in power throughout the decade, and reached new heights in the last few years. Now, what I'll be doing for the rest of the talk is focus mainly on the trajectory of Alibaba and its subsidiaries as an illustration of the growth of the broader fintech industry, while always keeping an eye on the reactions of the central government. In effect, what I'll be outlining is how the fintech industry came to occupy its seemingly systemic role in China, and how the government came to successively allow for, fear, and try to co-opt the emergence of this new entity. So the best way to understand the emergence of fintech platforms in China is as a response to the insufficiencies shown by traditional banking actors with regards to the goals the central government wanted to see achieved. Toward the end of the 2000s, the CCP announced a policy of economic rebalancing, formulated as a reorientation of the national economy away from the prior public investment dependent and export focused strategy, and toward a new configuration instead emphasizing domestic household consumption and propelled by a private sector expected to become more autonomous, but not necessarily more independent. Key for this transition would be a financial sector better able to fulfill its market functions of credit allocation. That is, in the prior macroeconomic configuration, traditional lending actors, namely the big four state-owned banking institutions, would mostly lend either to bigger, already established firms, or even better, to state-owned enterprises who were seen as risk-free, insofar as the state would bail them out in case their investment project failed. In comparison, smaller firms would often be unable to provide the collaterals required by these heavily regulated credit institutions, while most private citizens would neither have the collaterals nor the credit history demanded to access private loans. All in all, the strong regulations enforced by these state-owned banks prevented smaller economic actors to either launch their business or grow the scales of their activities. And so this so-called financially repressed economy was largely seen as an impediment to the growth of either domestic consumption or a private sector able to function without the intervention of the state, two central goals of the CCP's economic policy. Insofar as it recognized how these market inefficiencies resulted from state regulation, the CCP then allowed for a first phase of rapid development of a new and relatively unregulated sector of the financial market, namely the fintech industry. And so this whole transition really starts in 2010 with two key innovations within the Alibaba ecosystem. On the one end, the payment platform used by Alibaba customers since 2003, Alipay, is allowed by the government to process third-party online payments between customers and businesses on transactions otherwise unrelated to Alibaba, and so becomes a kind of payment service similar to what credit card services offered elsewhere in the world. Now, the growth of the service is rather phenomenal. By 2012, Alipay's third-party payment platform had over 800 million registered accounts and was processing 100 million transactions daily. On the other end, Alibaba also starts a micro-lending service only available to businesses operating on the Alibaba e-commerce platform, in which use the data collected on the platform and through its third-party payment service to modulate and personifies the terms of the loans. Now, the combination of these two relatively benign innovations represents at the time a true little revolution in the Chinese financial sector. Before that point, most of Chinese consumers had basically no credit history whatsoever. A central reason for this being how China never really adopted the credit card, instead using paper money all the way to basically this moment, with the start of Alipay's third-party payment platform. Whereas traditional banking institutions saw this dearth of background information as a dead end, fintech service providers like Ant Group and WeChat Pay of Tencent were able to use the broader ecosystem of digital service of their parent companies to first access a record of their borrowers' financial history, and second, use the conglomerate's infrastructures of big data analytics to process this information. And so, benefiting from superior information, the fintech platforms were able to lend to smaller enterprises, which were previously excluded from the traditional credit sector, and thus to answer to one of the financial market inefficiencies of the prior macroeconomic configuration. Now, a second phase in this movement of financial liberalization starts in mid to late 2013 with Ant Group's launch of Yue Bao. Basically, instead of transferring their money from their regular banking deposit accounts to their Alipay payment account every single time they needed to pay for something, the customers were offered to use Yue Bao's special deposit account that would offer around 4% interest rates without any restriction on fund withdrawal, whereas similar kind of accounts in traditional banking institutions only offered 0.35 interest rates. The deposits were then channeled in a loosely regulated money market fund, where they would be aggregated into microloans for other users, with this new peer-to-peer lending proving to be another instrument through which fintech could advance financial inclusion. The offer proved so competitive that in a span of 9 months, Yue Bao grew to become the 4th largest such money market funds in the world, with more investors using it in China than there were Chinese investors taking part in traditional Chinese equity markets. The explosive success of this money market platform and the continued growth of Ant Group's prior activities eventually forced the central government to reconsider the purely beneficial character of the fintech industry. Rather, fintech platforms were proving to be an increasingly central financial infrastructures in the life of a middle class, which was itself growing at staggering rates. In effect, the market strategy of a company like Ant Group was directly attuned to this last trend. While state-owned banking institutions had a firm grip on the 20% of customers who accounted for 80% of the financial market revenue, so basically the larger firms and the wealthiest investors, the fintech industry instead focused on the remaining 80% of customers, aka the workers, retirees, and other lay investors, who still accounted for the last 20% of market revenue. Besides, if one was to assume the success of the economic rebalancing policy, then this 80% of the population would come to represent an increasing share of the financial market revenue. All the while, the fintech sector would still possess this privileged, if not oligopolistic, access to this market segment. Now, from the perspective of the government, not only were fintech platforms fast becoming seemingly systemic and functionally essential financial actors, but their growth also represented a significant loss of legibility and control over the financial resource in question. Yue Bao's success, for instance, meant that the savings and other assets of workers and regular citizens, rather than being channeled into state-owned banks where they would reinforce the institutions the government would rely on in case of crisis to restabilize the economy, would instead be invested in financial networks significantly less regulated, transparent, and into which the government would have a much more challenging control. This proved, at a time of major economic transition and, by the way, increasing levels of household debt, an unacceptable level of exposure to financial instability. Now, this reinterpretation of the fintech sector as a new locus of macroeconomic instability prompts the central government to reconsider how it would deal with this growing industry. A change which, by the way, coincided with the start of what I would see as a broader reconfiguration of Chinese state power. A first key step in this reconfiguration is, of course, the launch in 2014 of the Social Credit System, or SCS, the previously mentioned dispositive of society-wide monitoring. Now, according to Rogier Cremiers, the best way to understand the SCS is as an entire ecology of fragmented initiatives that share a basic set of objectives, operational frameworks, and policy language, but which, generally speaking, hasn't quite achieved the degree of operational integration and coordination which in the West we might have imagined it had. And so, in 2015, the central government announced that it would allow 8 non-bank entities to launch pilot programs of private credit scoring systems equivalent to the FICO score we use in the West. This, I would say, should be seen as the CCP's first attempt at addressing the general issue of the fintech industry's inherent lack of legibility, namely by ensuring that its next phase of development would be much more regulated and aligned with the SCS framework. Now, these credit scoring systems, with Sesame Credit by Ant Group certainly amongst the most popular, are rapidly shown to be somewhat problematic, even in the eyes of the Chinese authorities, with Tencent-owned pilot programs, for instance, being forced to close down only a few months after its inception. Basically, the various programs were criticized for their partiality, insofar as each credit score systems would either overvalue in their algorithms the purchase done on their own affiliated platforms, or simply lack access to their customers' behaviors conducted on their competitors' platforms. Now, in 2018, this ongoing reconfiguration of state power makes two further strides. First off, President Xi Jinping managed to abolish the constitutional limit limiting the amount of presidential mandates he can serve, which arguably positions him as the strongest Chinese political figure since like Mao. And secondly, each of the private credit scoring systems are folded into a single entity, the Beihang Credit Scoring Bureau, which directly depends from the central banking authorities. Now, according to scholar Julian Groin, who was writing in 2019, the Beihang Bureau was to be progressively merged with the National Credit Information Sharing Platform, a centralized public depository itself accounting for over 400 datasets originating from some 30 central ministries and public agencies. So basically what the CCP managed to pull out through this whole period is to allow for still more modernization of the Chinese financial sector, while this time reinforcing rather than losing legibility and control over this sector. And so what happens through the next 2 years is basically still further growth from the fintech industry, but also still more instability within China's broader economy, which starts to show some serious signs of slowing down, while level of household debts also continue to increase, two trends vastly bolstered by the COVID crisis. Through the year 2020, the announcement of Ant Group's IPO gains greater and greater momentum insofar as Alibaba's 2014 stock market entry had already proven to Chinese and foreign investors how profitable this new IPO should be. Finally, in early November 2020, the regulatory authorities announced new rules directly impacting the profitability of Ant Group, which in turn forced the Shanghai and Hong Kong Stock Exchange to postpone and eventually withdraw the company's IPO. Now, critically, about a week and a half before these events, Jack Ma had one of his somewhat frequent public appearances where he criticized national regulators as basically incompetent and unable to foster the kind of good innovation that would ensure both financial liberalization and a relatively stable growth to the national economy. While obviously this had its impact in deciding the CCP's leadership to quash the company's IPO, and as I tried to demonstrate through the talk, there was more to this unforeseen cancellation than a simplistic wheel of retaliation. The entire Alibaba ecosystem had not only helped the country to become the first fintech industry in importance in the world, but also ensured its own place as the core infrastructure of 21st century economic life in China, as well as a key instrument in the government's project of mass surveillance. The Jack Ma tech empire had become, without question, a systemic entity who proved functionally essential in so many of the CCP's projects. Now, perhaps this could actually have continued for a while if Jack Ma had better respected the place the government was ready to leave him. But as I tried to demonstrate in the paper, which I think should be available on the conference website, through the years, the tech mogul had come to adopt many of the West ideas about the self-importance of great innovators, which he certainly considered himself to be, and certainly didn't quite align with the CCP's views. Not only innovation and economic growth required majestic captains of industry like himself, but the way in which Jack Ma understood both his company's business model and really his own social calling was in the goal of automating trust, be it through e-commerce platforms or credit scoring technologies. Because of this strange correspondence between Jack Ma's goals and the CCP's own objectives of social monitoring and enforcing trust through algorithmic means, I would argue there were only two realistic outcomes to the relationship between these two. Either perfect alignment of Jack Ma's ecosystem with the government policies, or a confrontation where he had virtually no chance to prevail. In this sense, the cancellation of Ant Group's IPO should be seen as symptomatic of the CCP's own evaluation of Jack Ma's willingness to fully adopt the party's line, and now, in retrospective, appears as the opening salve of a large-scale antitrust operation through which the central government is, to this day, bludgeoning the key actors of the fintech industry back into their place. Thank you.
Thanks, Marius. That was great, and plenty of food for thought. We now have time for questions. So please feel free, if you have a question, to put it in the question box, Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Yeah, but I found it to be kind of an interesting kind of overview of how fintech is kind of taking shape in China. Maybe just to begin, I'd ask Marius, what impact do you think the pandemic has had on all of this? Like, you allude to it, but I'd be curious to know how things have changed over the past year.
I mean, it definitely like accelerated a collision course that was already like programmed in a way. So like in the same way that Amazon like became so much more important in the West, and Group and Alibaba overall just became so much more important and prevalent. And like, so on the one hand, it seems like China became more dependent upon all these cloud infrastructures and all of that ecosystem, but also like their whole economy, like the whole Chinese economy became more, it's intensified the already present instability of that economy. So like it just it both like boosted the valuation of Ant Group, because people were like realizing how much like that kind of actors would become so much more important, and also like even more freaked out the Chinese government as to the state of their economy. And like they were just, the impression I've got is just that they were like having the impression of losing control, and they reacted that much more fiercely, right?
One thing that I found interesting was this kind of relationship between dependency, where the CCP is increasingly dependent on these kind of technologies, and at the same time, it seems like they're kind of trying to ward them off. So I wonder to what extent there's a tendential kind of relationship where this is just going to be an ongoing problem over the next few years, that's kind of structurally inbuilt into the whole process.
Yeah, it's like at the end of like working on that presentation and of the paper that I did last semester, the thing that I'm more intrigued by is like basically like Jack Ma and the Alibaba ecosystem, like their focus on automating trusts, and the government own focus on like its own version of automating trust. Like where exactly, what is the common genealogical roots, and like how come, they don't seem to be able to untangle one from the other. Like they're gonna have, either they're gonna have to like nationalize the whole thing, but it seems that whole infrastructure seems so central to what the government is trying to achieve right now, that state of dependency. I don't know what's going to happen with that anytime soon, right?
Anyone else have other questions for Marius on fintech in China? I mean, the other thing I liked about your paper and your presentation is like a lot of people try to explain this stuff through focusing on actor network theory, right? And looking at how all of this is an outcome of these kind of assemblages created through the technology, but you do a good job of showing how there's a kind of larger politics at work around this kind of stuff. So maybe you could speak to this. It also makes me think about Polanyi, and to the extent that it speaks to kind of market society relationships and how they're taking shape in China. And I'm wondering about how fintech might be contributing to the destabilization of the economy, or is seen as a risk for destabilizing the economy in China.
Yeah, through the last decade, like the 2015, there was like a mini stock market crash in China in 2015, 2016. And to a large account, it seemed to be related to like wealth management products and like all these little innovations, not necessarily produced by fintech per se, but by like smaller regional banks who were trying to like get consumers from outside of their provincial restrictions. And all these smaller banking actors trying to get on the internet to get the the gold rush of what they were seeing Alibaba and Tencent going through. And like, yeah, the first phases of fintech, or like how they calling it, shadow banking, the first phases of like that expansion definitely created a lot of trouble inside the stock market in China. Was like, I don't know if it's hundreds of millions or actual billions of dollars who were like frauded and disappeared. And it's just like a very time compressed period of an industry booming, with the government just like staying on the sidelines saying like, yeah, whatever, we're just like giving you some rope to see what's going to happen with that. And right now they're just like super compressing and taking back control. And this is the shape that it's taking, right? Like literally billions of dollars of fines on Alibaba and Tencent, and like the apparently common habit of the government of like putting billionaires in jail, and Jack Ma disappearing from the public scene for like 3 months. And like, it seems to be some very eventful months since like November 2020.
Great. So we have one question from Roy Culpepper. He says, how would you characterize the Chinese financial system? Is it fragile, vulnerable to irrational exuberance and crisis? Has the action of the CCP served to make the financial sector more stable, avoiding the weaknesses of Western financial systems?
Damn, I'm no specialist on the Chinese financial sector, but I feel like the CCP's decisions are in a way adding to that instability, because investors have no damn clue what's going to happen. Like the same way that there was this kind of esoteric science of trying to understand what was going on the other side of the Soviet iron wall. Like there's something similar right now in the Chinese tech scene in trying to interpret the micro signs that we might have of like what's the CCP is going to do with that. So it definitely adds to instability and to like wild fluctuations in the markets. But then at the same time, they're definitely trying to avoid like the more Western 2008 financial crisis. Like they've maybe like last year, I think, they've enforced new regulations about like they've forbidden high rises from over a certain height, just because they saw that as the expression or an avenue for like more speculative like problems. And like no way this could be possible in the West, but there's actually the Chinese government who's able to take these seemingly too authoritarian decisions, but which might make sense on a purely political economic level, I would say. So yeah.
Thanks. Maybe we can move on now and maybe come back to questions at the end
Sure.
for both our presenters. Actually, hearing your talk, Marius, it actually makes me see some interconnections with Leah's talk in terms of how people are relying on these networks for support, you know, in the context of the pandemic. It's just the fintech sector seems much more based on debt-based kind of relationships. So maybe we can kind of come back to that at the end. But I just wanted to introduce our next speaker, Leah Barrett Werner, who is presenting a paper entitled A Necessary Risk, a Case for Universal Basic Income as Permanent Post-Pandemic Policy. So take it away, Leah.
Thanks to Marius for your talk, and thanks, Chris, so to the organizers of the panel. It is going to be there are some interrelated themes for sure, but also quite different at the same time. So I'm going to talk about basic income and specifically as post-pandemic policy, and mostly in the Canadian context. And policy, if implemented, could contribute to an expansion of what we think of work. And it's first a brief definition of the term, even though I think a lot of people know what it is by now. So it goes by a lot of different names and it's been interpreted in many different ways. But basically, what's common is that it's an unconditional and guaranteed income without means testing and work requirement. And the question I kind of want to pose and discuss is what it would take for basic income or universal basic income, as referred to become a permanent post-pandemic policy. And it's a topic I did research on as Chris, specifically in the Canadian context. I hope my internet is okay. I just got a little notification that it was unstable.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
So reflecting on the potential social transformations in our post-pandemic society, I want to draw on two. On James Ferguson and Cassie, who argue or to suggest that basic income, if implemented, would represent a paradigm shift in a certain sense, in that it decouples income from expectations of work. And this is or could be in varying degrees depending on the interpretations and versions of the idea as it translates to policy. And in this way, it would transform in some ways the role of the welfare state, or the current iteration and neoliberal welfare, because it marks a departure from the state as providing this kind of last resort, minimal income support that steps in when the job or the individual fails and instead becomes a more primary income provider. So it's an idea that's been around for a while. It's not new, and support for it has kind of come and gone in the last decade. It's been taken up and supported by many different actors and politicians across the political spectrum. Notably, it was popular in the 1970s, and it was tested in both Canada and the US, but then it public eye after that. And in the last 5 to 10 years, it's made kind of a comeback. And there have been pilot projects around the world testing it in these forms, including here in Canada, the one I alluded to before in the province of Ontario, where I conducted fieldwork. But so far, actually led to the policy becoming permanent. It sort of always suffered from being temporary and never really making it the step further. I'm not really going to get much more into the history, but it's just to give a sense that before the pandemic, there was already momentum around the idea. But I think it was still somehow a fringe issue and reserved to certain circles. And so in the pandemic, and the world went into these government-mandated lockdowns, when so many people around the globe lost their jobs, saw their livelihoods disappear, the idea of a guaranteed livable income independent from employment and a range of other conditions really came into the spotlight in a way I think was quite unprecedented far in the history of the idea. I think it had a lot of people wondering if this was the moment when there would be a shift in the way we consider income, and if the pandemic was making the case for it, and whether this enormous crisis, which touched on so many aspects of our lives, was a catalyst that was needed for ushering this kind of policy into being. And I'm going to return to some of the kinds of arguments that was made in income, but I first want to just talk about the pandemic relief policies in Canada, which helped to put further on the. So at first, when the lockdowns happened last year and a year ago today, a little bit more than a year, the initial responses from the Canadian government included a proposal for wage subsidies for employers and expand employment insurance scheme. So supports that were really tied to more formal employment status. It then became obvious that a lot of precariously employed did not qualify for employment insurance, that there were still a lot of people falling through the cracks of the system. And this led to the really very swift creation of further pandemic relief programs. And during this deliberation process where they were scrambling to put together these emergency response benefits, there are a lot of calls from different advocacy groups, and a lot of them which I worked with during my fieldwork as well, calling for the government to implement a more unconditional model, or like a basic income-like model. What they did implement was the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, or the CERB, as it's sort of popularly referred to in Canada. And it provided 2,000 Canadian dollars per month for up to 6 months. It was intended for those who didn't qualify for other programs. And it was still on the condition that one had to earn a certain amount in employment income from the previous year. So it was still meant for those who had been employed in the formal economy in some capacity. But by many, and I think especially those who had advocated for basic income for a long time, and also for those who were kind of newly introduced to this kind of measure, they saw it as an unintended national experiment with basic income. And at the same time, with the limitations of the policies, I think it also became more clear in what ways a more unconditional and universal approach would be better. And I want to kind of briefly go over what I think some of those reasonings are, which I've already mentioned, and which relates to the panel theme is precarity. Obviously, it became really obvious the amount of people living in precarious working situations who are falling through the cracks of the income system, which brought about, I think, a more mainstream debate on this that also made it clear that it wasn't just a pandemic problem, and it had also been a problem leading up to for a long time. And what also became clear were some of the inadequacies of the current social assistance system, so welfare and disability insurance. And one kind of glaring example is the amount of 2,000 Canadian dollars per month that the CERB and also the expanded employment insurance benefits operated with was actually higher than the social assistance rates for what you would receive if you are in social assistance. And another one is health and safety. So for those who were working on the front lines and essential workers and were not working at home, going to work became associated to the potential of contracting a life-threatening disease. And so the appeal of exit or of freedom work, which is an argument that's often made in favor of basic income, especially by many who argue for basic income from a more post-work perspective. This became really relevant. And it's basically the idea that if you have guaranteed income level, you have power to say no to a job. And none of these income support policies, including the new ones, allowed for this kind of choice. All of them had written into it that you cannot have voluntarily given a job, you have to have lost your job due to COVID, etc. And then last, there is the question of care is on essential work. It became much more obvious how much unpaid care work that people, and of course, especially women, were doing that to be remunerated, valued equal to paid employment. And another element on a more societal level, there was a deep appreciation about what work is really essential. And I think that the normalization of the language of essential workers versus non-essential work is really interesting. And I think it opened the door, at least partially, and it's, I don't know if that door will open, but to a questioning of the focus on creating new jobs, and if we really need them, and what jobs we do need and what jobs we don't. So while all of this is going on, basic income, or why is it that basic income is then not translated into a permanent policy in Canada or really anywhere in the world? And before kind of attempting to give an answer to this, or a part of an answer to this, because it's obviously a complicated issue, I want to just take a step to and the right critiques that are made against basic income is central to this. It's close to the deep cultural association between work and income, and to this expectation that we have to work to make a living that Kathy Weeks writes quite extensively about. So traditionally on the right, it's reflected obviously in the pull yourself up by the bootstraps ideology, which we're all probably familiar with, that it's an individual's duty to sell their time on the labor market. Handouts is a disincentive to work. And this has been one of the main obstacles to the implementation of basic income. And also a familiar rhetoric to that was to also justify increasingly welfare policies. There's also a prominent left critique of basic income, which includes trust of this kind of policy, because, and this is something that James Ferguson points out, some of the ways in which basic income has been presented reflect values that are often ascribed to a liberal ideology, such as being entrepreneurial, risk-taking behavior, etc. And rather, there's a preference for a system like a guarantee, a universal jobs guarantee, and improving wages, workers' rights and conditions, strengthening existing employment and such. This in turn relates to what I'm suggesting, which is that for basic income to become permanent policy, there has to be some sort of degree of a questioning of the value of work, because the strength of the basic income, really unconditional basic income, is to enable and place value on activities outside of paid employment as well, such as care work, for example. And what is notable about the pandemic, or maybe rather, the first part of the pandemic really, is that work was centered in because in a global lockdown, in a government mandated lockdown, no one can really blame anyone for losing their jobs or even for choosing not to work because of health concerns. And further, the creation of jobs or a job guarantee is out of the question. And so this way to shift understandings of what's at stake. And for those who had opposed it in the past, there was, in some cases, an increased legitimacy around it because there was no viable alternative of employment. So, post-pandemic, the approach to income support gonna undergo a shift where income indeed becomes less tied to employment status or ability. And I wonder if we can speak of a shift in the way we consider work and this notion that we have to work to make a living, if that's being questioned in any way. And I think considering the fact that the policies, the basic income-like policies in Canada and also elsewhere in policies that were implemented are temporary, and the reluctance at making them unconditional and independent from employment status, as well as the recent discourse surrounding a pandemic recovery and what that entails, I don't think that it's really on the horizon to become a permanent policy at the moment. For instance, just a brief example, the focus and priority is to get quote unquote Canada back to work, which is something the Canadian finance minister recently put it when the government was presenting their budget. The focus is very much on new job creation, and between growth and jobs is fortified. And I think part of the reason why the Canadian government could justify these basic income-like policies was because work was not an option at the time. And also, I think, just as a side note, because part of for giving people was that it was good for the economy, it was provide a boost, give consumers more purchasing power, etc. So that said, though, and as an end note, maybe a more optimistic one, there has been an enormous push for basic income across many different groups and aisles, and even at the parties, at the Liberal Party of Canada's convention, it was voted as one of the top policy priorities. And I think the existence of the pandemic policies, as well as this continued questioning of what constitutes essential work, plus the emphasis on all the underpaid or non-paid care work that's being done, all have contributed to furthering a discussion on the relationship between income and work, and on whether we should continue this focus with job creation, which also kind of lastly relates to a more sustainable direction in our economy. And that's that. Thank you. We'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Leah. That was great. And we have some time for questions now on Leah's presentation. Does anybody have any comments, questions about universal basic income? Feel free to put them in the Q&A box. One thing I found interesting with the pandemic was that, in sociology, we have that kind of distinction between private troubles and public issues. C. Wright Mills kind of came up with, and when we talk about the problem of being unemployed, it's often treated as a private trouble, right? And I'm curious to what extent the pandemic has demonstrated how this is a public issue. And to what extent that way of problematizing it will endure post-pandemic. So I'm wondering if you could speak to how people might reframe this problem as a public issue kind of going forward.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it is kind of one of the things that characterizes the discourse surrounding employment in the pandemic. And I think the demand that went into creating those pandemic policies really spoke to that as well. And it was really like I think that the option of not creating these policies, or it wasn't an option, sort of, and I think the language surrounding it really spoke to also, on a very optimistic note, the government really listening to that, as well as there was, as I spoke to as well. It becomes really impossible to blame the individual for not working and for not having employment when the government, when it's a government mandated lockdown, right? It becomes kind of a collective issue. And we expect the government to fix because, they're mandating the lockdown. So it really shifts kind of the responsibility, which is.
So we have one question here from Max, who asks, do you think there's a connection between basic income and the obsession with economic growth as the solution to all social problems? Could basic income be part of moving away from that obsession?
I mean, yeah, I think that there's kind of a part of the discussion on basic income and in the literature, which is, on degrowth and basic income, and in the rhetoric of the in the Canadian example, like when they were talking the new budget and the focus on, job creations, it is very linked to, economic growth. And shifting away from that, I definitely think that that sadly, though, I don't think it's happening. And part of the arguments that's being made also for basic income is that it can, on the other side, also grow the economy, and it can create incentives for people to work. And I think why a lot of advocates are also drawing on that line of argumentation is because it holds so much more sway and it's so much more efficient, right? Which is I'm ambivalent about, because on the one hand, it could maybe help it become a reality, but on the other hand, it also shifts the attention from something that I think it does have the potential of being a part of, like what it's been talking, like this kind of Green New Deal, or a shift away from reduction.
I also just wanted to say, to give a shout out to your master's thesis, which you just defended here. I supervised it, and I thought maybe you could speak a little bit to that. But Leah did field work in Lindsay, Ontario, where they just completed they didn't complete a pilot project. It was canceled by the Doug Ford government, the Conservative government in Ontario, but it was implemented initially as a pilot project under the Liberals, and before they were they were voted out in the last elections. And Leah did field work with people in Lindsay who were receiving basic income. And one thing I thought was interesting about your field work was that, in your correspondence with people on UBI, like it seemed like what UBI did was it centered focus on problems of just living every day that that people need to confront, rather than focusing on problems of economy, right? Or making employment the front and center kind of element in how they're addressing their everyday problems. So I thought it's interesting when you think about it in the context of the pandemic, right? Because just the problem of living every day in some ways for people has become decoupled from these questions about growing the economy or whatever. And people are just trying to get by. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I thought maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, for sure. And I thought about also including some of that, but it was, there's what was really, what I wrote a lot about in my thesis, and what was really interesting about it was exactly that it became something that has been so theoretical and abstract and economic and about public policy, etc., became something really deeply personal to people. And it became really intertwined into their, like their, as you say, like their everyday experiences and their life trajectories and the way that they also thought about themselves in a sense. And so I think the relationship I have to it is much different because of it as well, because, I think a lot about those stories in it. And I think one of the also important or significant things that comes out of pilot projects is this, and also, and as well as the pandemic policies, is that it becomes a personal issue, and it becomes an issue that kind of is linked to these like everyday, intimate, emotional, lived experiences.
Yeah, that's great, and it makes me think about embedded markets when we're getting into Polanyi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about that too.
Polanyi scholar, but the idea that this kind of way of receiving assistance is embedded in people's everyday lives, and it's something people will carry with them afterwards. I know that's not how Polanyi meant embedded. But it's interesting. So we have two questions that are interlinked, so I thought I'd ask both of them together. Max asks, what do you think about the recent adoption of the Liberal Party of basic income to their party platform? So that's the first one, and Marius has one in the chat that's connected to the possibility of right-wing parties adopting UBI, right? And so I mean, it gets into questions of partisan politics and the adoption of these kinds of policies.
Mm-hmm. So first to the question on the Liberal Party, I think it's significant because I think when previously asked, they haven't really taken a stance on it. And this is the biggest party in Canada and the party currently in government. And the Prime Minister has kind of come out in the past really against it, actually, and rejected it. And so when they voted it, and it became the number 2 policy priority for the party platform, which has no real binding power. It was voted from the MPs and the grassroots of the party. So and in the budget speech there was no mention of it. Which means it's not really on the horizon, but at the same time, I think it does reflect a growing support for it and a growing momentum around it, and also that it's really coming more into the mainstream and making its way into the center of the political spectrum. And to Marius, to your question, I haven't really seen that in my research. It's something I've also wondered about, but I haven't come across that so much. But it's been taken up by the right before, not recently really, but in the Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, actually, they were both proponents of basic income. But on the nativist far right, I don't know if it would be a policy that they would take up. I would think I would be reluctant to think so, although I guess nothing is really out of the question.
I'm reading an interesting book by Melinda Cooper called Family Values Between Neoliberalism and the New Social Conservatism. And she gets into how these debates played out in the United States in the 70s, which is really interesting. Actually, I was going to recommend it to you, Leah. But, it talks about how, Friedman and neoliberals in the early days were advocates of basic income. They even got Nixon to try to push for it, and it was kind of overturned for all kinds of reasons. But her argument is basically that part of what has kept the right from adopting these kind of policies is that UBI is very individual-centered, right? It's like everyone is eligible for these benefits by virtue of being a citizen in their country. And with social conservatism, it's turned to become a lot more family-centered, where it's like you are eligible for benefits by virtue of being a part of a family. So I'm wondering if that, we've talked about how there's this commitment to work as an ethic, right? The ethic that everyone should be employed, and that's the reason why we have punitive kind of welfare policies. But I'm wondering also about this family-centered approach to welfare and whether that might kind of hamper the adoption of UBI.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. And there are some, policies already that like the Canada Child credit and parental credits you get, which are kind of basic income and also something that actually so that kind of are based on the family, and it's also something that advocates for basic income use a lot, actually, to advocate for it, see it works, etc. So I think that sort of already exists in a way. But I'm not sure about that approach. How I feel about it personally, I would
it's interesting how it connects back to how we understand social reproduction, and unpaid labor as well as paid employment. So, are there any other questions, comments for Leah in the Q&A, or Marius, Carlos, if you want to jump in, feel free. Or we could also just see if there's any more questions for Marius, any kind of follow-ups on the conversation as it's kind of developed. Doesn't look like it. So maybe we can wrap up a little bit early. I just wanted to thank you both for presenting two very interesting papers, and I wanted to thank our audience for sticking around on Friday night. And I know some of you are in Europe, which is it's 10 o'clock on Friday night right now. So yeah, I hope you all have a good Friday and a good weekend. And yeah, thanks for attending.
Thanks.
Bye.